Welcome back, nerdlings. So, see what you like better, with me in that corner or without me in the corner and just my voice. We'll see if it's maybe less. Just I don't know. We'll see what your preference is. We continue with our lecture on the progressives. Jane Dandy, who is this young man? That is Teddy Roosevelt. Yes, Roosevelt, from a wealthy, privileged New York family. When he first entered politics in the 1880s, he was seen as too effeminate for politics. This word you'll encounter in one of his speeches, over civilized. And his fellow politicians called him a Jane Dandy. You're too delicate, Teddy. You're too delicate for politics. So Roosevelt realized he had an image problem from pretty early on. He was going to have to figure out how to settle that. The turning point for Roosevelt really came on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1884. Now, you guys think you might have had some bad Valentine's Day experiences in your life? Roosevelt lost his wife and his mother on the same day. The light has gone out of my life. Roosevelt was a broken man. He went out west. He reinvented himself as the manly man, the rough rider, the pioneer, the strenuous lifer. All of these things, the guy who is now up on Mount Rushmore, all of those things, he became that. He was not that from the beginning. He certainly was not raised that way. But he became those things in light of significant personal tragedy. He came back to New York, entered into politics. Again, you'll get some of these details on Roosevelt's life from the Gerstle book. He would go when the Spanish-American War, which you'll be reading about, we'll be lecturing about in a future lecture, the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt would again take this as an opportunity to, as he saw it, strengthen the nation, as we talked about in the Gerstle book. But also to, again, prove himself that he was no Jane Dandy, that he was, in fact, the Rough Rider, the Rough Riders who would take the cavalry, who would take San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. Again, we'll talk more about that war in the future. Roosevelt comes back. I should say, too, you can go on YouTube because we do have moving pictures by the time of the Spanish-American War. You can go on YouTube and you can Google Spanish-American War original footage, something like that. Or Rough Riders original footage. You can see actual camera footage of the Rough Riders at San Juan. Should you choose to, pursue your historical interests further, Roosevelt comes back and is just this mythic celebrity American, signaling the solution, the cure for what ailed the United States. Roosevelt would give a speech, the Strenuous Life speech, where he laid out a vision of national preparedness, a vision for what America needed to do to get ready to enter into the 20th century. I'm not going to talk about this because you're actually going to be reading about it and writing about it for your first discussion board assignment. So you will capture some of Roosevelt's message there, but he would deliver this speech around the country in 1899 and 1900. Roosevelt would serve as governor of New York during these years. I think 1898 is when he was elected, and then he went off to fight in the Rough Riders, came back, and wanted to continue in politics, but wanted to continue in politics as a progressive. And something I should insert too, progressivism is coming out of the Republican Party. Robert La Follette is a Republican. Teddy Roosevelt is a Republican. So I know that many of you are thinking, so this is where these Democratic liberal Obama types are coming from. They're coming from the progressives. Understand, progressivism begins in the Republican Party with people like La Follette and Teddy Roosevelt. Problem is, other Republicans didn't like this. They didn't like the progressives. They wanted to continue with a more deregulated economy and limited government. And so Roosevelt was a danger. So how do you get rid of a popular politician, or how do you how do you disarm, I guess, a popular politician in your party? At the time, you make him vice president. And that's what happened. William McKinley will run for the presidency, Republican, for his second term, and he will bring on Teddy Roosevelt as his running mate. Roosevelt will give his strenuous life speech, really bolstering McKinley's policies, foreign policies. We'll talk more about those in a future lecture. And they will win the presidency in 1900. And everything is good as long as nothing happens to William McKinley, and Roosevelt is there able to, provide the celebrity for the Republican Party while not really having any power. This is really the best of both worlds as far as the party is concerned. Again, as long as nothing happens to William McKinley. And nothing ever happens to a president, right? Like they never get shot or assassinated, right? Except when they do. William McKinley will be assassinated in 1901. And suddenly, Teddy Roosevelt, who most Republicans hated, is now the president of the United States, and begins to enact his strenuous life vision for the country. Roosevelt imagines a more energetic, active government, like I talked about in the previous lecture. He believes in many of the progressive ideals and reforms. He will begin instituting those as president. You might know Teddy Roosevelt is known as the trust buster. What is that? Well, trust was another name for monopoly or these large corporations. Roosevelt will be the first president to start using legislation that was already on the books. Roosevelt didn't pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. That was passed all the way back in 1890 by Congress. Under pressure from farmers and other constituents about these robber baron corporations, from Americans who are fearing the size of these corporations, Congress is like, all right, we need to do something. We need to appear to do something, and so they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act literally outlaws monopolies in the United States. Any restriction on free trade or free competition is illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So you probably shouldn't have railroads or Standard Oil under the Antitrust Act. Those are trusts. Sherman says those are illegal. Except Sherman is never used that way. In the 1890s, Sherman is only ever used to break up labor unions, which were seen as trusts in and of themselves. So Sherman Antitrust Act ended up being the tool not of progressives but of conservatives in the 1890s to break up labor unions, but not really do anything to police corporations, which were was the intended target of Sherman after all. Roosevelt says, enough of this. We're actually going to use Sherman to investigate and, if need be, to bust corporations, to bust the trusts. Roosevelt's philosophy, and giving you this quote from memory, Roosevelt would say, corporations are creatures of the state, and the state not only has a right to control them, it is duty bound or has a responsibility to control them. Roosevelt introduces a new word into the progressive lexicon, the language of control. Government has a responsibility to control corporations. Remember, Robert La Follette in Wisconsin had talked about public ownership of corporations. Roosevelt is bringing that now into national government and saying it is responsibility of the federal government to control these monopolies, to control the railroads, to control a U.S. Steel or a Standard Oil or an Armour Swift. It's a pretty harsh language, again, raising the question, is Roosevelt a socialist? In calling for government controlling corporations, isn't that what Lenin and Stalin and the communists in the Soviet Union, or Chairman Mao in communist China, what they would do? Or is there other ways of understanding Teddy Roosevelt? Is there a way of understanding Roosevelt, as I suggested, I think in a lecture, those farmers, where those farmers in calling for price fixing for corporate, were they socialists? Or were they conservatives wanting to kind of roll back the clock to an earlier time in which the government did create corporations and did keep a close eye on those corporations, right? What was new in American life was not government supervision or control of corporations. What was new in American life was large corporations without government oversight. That was the innovation. And it was an innovation that many Americans rejected. And Teddy Roosevelt's the first national politician to say, yeah, the people are right. We need, the government in particular, needs to exert more, control. He's not, as you can see from the picture there, Roosevelt was not about to bust all the trusts. He was not going to go after railroads if he thought that they were providing a decent public service. He wasn't going to break up Wanamaker's if he thought Wanamaker's provided for better social service. He distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts. Good trusts, he would suggest, should even have the support of government. If railroads are acting responsibly, if Wanamaker's is acting responsibly, government should encourage monopolies or trusts in that regard. But the bad ones, the ones behaving badly, they need to get busted. During Teddy Roosevelt's filling out McKinley's term and then his own term from 1904 to 1908, Roosevelt's Justice Department would enact 40 antitrust suits, the most famous coming in 1890, when the greatest monopoly of them all, Standard Oil, was busted. And Roosevelt's reputation as the trust buster, as the federal government officer who was looking out for the little guy and trying to restore or save economic competition in America, this Roosevelt, the trust buster, his legacy is sealed. Interestingly, John Rockefeller goes from being a multimillionaire to a multi-billionaire as he's forced to sell off Standard Oil, and so Standard Oil becomes SoCal, Standard Oil of California, or Standard Oil of Texas or of New Jersey. As he's forced to sell off his company, he makes incredible amounts of money. Rockefeller, at one point, I think at the high point of his financial career, he had $334 billion. Just unprecedented wealth amassed by John Rockefeller and his family. Thanks in part to the trust buster. So sometimes the rich just get richer. But this is Teddy Roosevelt, a more active government that's going to bust the bad trusts. He also oversees the creation of the Bureau of Corporations. Think of Bureau of Corporations as kind of like a policeman for the American economy, particularly for the larger corporations. The Bureau of Corporations has the power to open investigation into corrupt corporations, force them to open their books to show their practices, and if they're misbehaving, they can be fined or they can even be shut down. This is the federal government exercising control over the corporations under Teddy Roosevelt. The Hepburn Act of 1906. The Hepburn Act empowers an earlier regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission of 1887. The U.S. Constitution gives the federal government the power to regulate interstate commerce. They are under pressure from people complaining about these robber barons and their corrupt practices of, say, freight rates, ticket prices. And so while they're passing the Sherman Antitrust Act, Congress also passes the Interstate Commerce Commission to make it appear that the federal government is taking issues of corporate abuse or corporate malfeasance seriously, but they don't actually do anything with the Interstate Commerce Commission. It doesn't really, provide any kind of regulation or anything until 1906. And under Roosevelt, the Hepburn Act empowers the Interstate Commerce Commission to set maximum freight rates by the railroad. In other words, the Hepburn Act gives the ICC the power to set prices for the railroads. This is something that farmers and others had been arguing for, this kind of thing. This is something the states had been passing in bits and pieces here and there. Now the federal government is saying a federal agency is now going to have the power to tell railroads how much they can or can't charge their customers. Price fixing. This is socialism, right? The government controlling prices rather than the market controlling prices. This is the kind of thing that will be called socialism in the 20th century. Are the progressive socialists? Well, when you look at the congressional debates over the Hepburn Act, what you see is the phrase public interest, and I talked about this in the previous lecture. This is language that goes back to the Founding Fathers. And Congress didn't see themselves as looking forward to socialism, but looking backward to the Founding Fathers. We need a regulatory system in the United States. Now that with these new corporations and the new interdependence, we need a regulatory system in the United States that will be in the public interest, not just simply in private interest. And this language of public interest recalls the Founding Fathers, and it was the kind of justifications that Congress is providing at this time. So again, there's not, at least from the standpoint of people at this time, there's not some kind of great socialist takeover in government at this time. They really see themselves as returning to the vision of the Founding Fathers in calling for a more active government that more actively, curbs the influence of centralized power, both in politics but also in the economy as well, too. Roosevelt will be president when the great coal strike of 1902, coal strike in Pennsylvania, which was shutting down the railroad lines nationally. Roosevelt, the federal government has intervened in strikes before, as we've seen. This is the first time the federal government comes in really as neutral observers. Roosevelt sends his people in for the coal strike with the instructions to kind of hear both sides out and to play both sides. Roosevelt was not a fan of labor unions, of collective bargaining. That was not something he supported. But in the coal strike of 1902, he and his investigators would ultimately side with the workers. They would tell the owners of the mining companies, give the workers what they want. They want a living wage, give them that wage. They want 8 hours, give them the 8 hours. Meet their demands so we can get this national strike over with and we can get the economy running again like tomorrow. First time the federal government has ever intervened on the side of workers in a strike. That comes under Teddy Roosevelt. We go on to talk about, his conservation efforts and all sorts of other things. But clearly, Roosevelt rhetorically stands for a different kind of America. Stands for what he calls the square deal. He will use this term. What I want to offer Americans is simply a square deal. He'll say, look, if somebody, and he talks to him from a military standpoint, if a guy is willing to stand by me in war, then I want to offer him a square deal in civilian life. We need to do more, in other words, to include more Americans in the promise of this new American life. In fact, Roosevelt will read a book in 1908, The Promise of American Life. And he's like, yeah, this is kind of what I'm about. This is written by Herbert Croly, one of the great progressive intellectuals. Roosevelt was like, yeah, this is kind of what I've been wanting or imagining. This is what I want to do. Roosevelt will leave office in 1908. He kept his promise. He said, look, yeah, I wasn't elected to a first term. I took over for McKinley, but in 1904, he said, look, if you elect me again, I'll treat that as my second term. I'm not going to run again. And he kept his promise. So he left, read Crowley's book, went to Africa, shot some animals, comes back to the United States in a few years and doesn't like what the Republican Party under his successor, William Howard Taft, is doing. He feels like it's not continuing with the progressive ideals that he had tried to begin to incorporate. That the new Republican Party of Taft was not committed to offering a square deal, and now it's true. Taft actually his His Justice Department actually oversaw more antitrust suits than did Roosevelt's. Still, Roosevelt felt that the Republican Party was betraying his square deal, and so he comes back to Republican leaders and says, "Hey, guys, don't worry. I'll run in 1912, and we'll restore the Republican Party to its progressive agenda." And Roosevelt and the Republicans say, "We don't like you. Go away." And Roosevelt says, "Okay, fine. I'm going to take my party and I'm going to go build my own party." And so Roosevelt in 1910 tours the country, talking about the new nationalism. And let's look a little bit at Roosevelt's speech. I apologize. I do not have the part of the speech where he talks about American democracy, or American meaning nothing unless it can realize a real democracy. That this language that Jane Addams had talked about, Roosevelt is picking up this language here in 1910, and speaking in a more a bolder, progressive language than he had espoused before. Again, a lot of it had to do with his reading of Herbert Crowley's book and his feeling that the country needed to go further down the road in the direction that progressives have been advocating. So let's just look at some highlights from this speech. In every wise struggle for human betterment, one of the main objects, and often the only object, has been to achieve in large measure equality of opportunity. One of the hallmarks of Roosevelt's progressivism and liberalism throughout the 20th century is centered around the word equality. They talk about it maybe less than the word freedom. Are freedom and equality mutually exclusive values, or is it a zero-sum game? For you to have equality, you have to have less freedom. To have more freedom, you have to have less equality. These are issues that we need to take up as we go through this class. But the language of equality of opportunity is one that Roosevelt and the progressives are introducing, that eventually liberals like a Franklin Roosevelt all the way up to a Barack Obama and a Joe Biden would be taking up. A large measure of equality of opportunity in the struggle for this great end, nations rise from barbarism to civilization, and through its people press forward from one stage of enlightenment to the next. One of the chief factors in progress is the destruction of special privilege. And this became common as well to the progressive lineage of decrying privilege, and they're especially talking about corporate privilege, business privilege. We need to destroy special privilege. Lobbyists, wealthy individuals. The essence of any struggle for healthy liberty has always been and must always be to take from one man or class of men the right to enjoy power or wealth or position or immunity which has not been earned by service to his or their fellows. This is what you fought for in the Civil War. This is what we strive for now. Roosevelt suggesting that in the Civil War you fought to the North fought to end the Southern aristocracy of slave owning. We sought to equalize opportunity for all persons in North America, not just for white persons. And Roosevelt is suggesting that that's kind of we're kind of continuing the Civil War. We are still fighting aristocracy. We are still fighting special privileges. As now we're fighting the robber barons. At every stage and under all circumstances, the essence of the struggle is to equalize opportunity, destroy privilege, and give to the life and citizenship of every individual the highest possible value, both to himself and to the Commonwealth. I stand for the square deal, but when I say that I am for the square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the games, but that I stand for having those rules changed so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and of reward for equally good service. I'll just scroll through this in case you guys want to stop your stop your YouTube at any point and just kind of read through more of it yourself. There can be no effective control of corporations while their political activity remains. No man should receive $1 unless that dollar has been fairly earned. The really big fortune, the swollen fortune, by the mere fact of its size, acquires qualities which differentiate in kind as well as in degree from what it possessed by men of relatively small means. Therefore, I believe in a graduated income tax. That was something Wisconsin had pioneered as well too, a graduated income tax on big fortunes, meaning that the more you the more you make, the higher your income, the higher tax rate that you pay. It's graduated. The belief of progressives was if you make more money, it's because you are drawing more upon society. And thus you should have a greater share of responsibility to that society for the wealth that it has produced for you. And so you owe a fair share back. You might disagree with that logic. You might think of graduated income tax as robbing from the rich to give to the poor. I'm not going to try to convince you otherwise. The American people are right in demanding that the new nationalism, without which we cannot hope to deal with new problems. The new nationalism puts the nationality before sectional or personal advantage. This new nationalism regards the executive power as the steward of the public welfare. It demands of the judiciary that it should be interested primarily in human welfare rather than in property, just as it demands the representative body should represent all the people rather than any one class or section of the people. Now that call for a strengthening of executive power as the steward of the public welfare was one that scared conservatives at the time and scare conservatives still today. But do understand this, that Teddy Roosevelt was the first politician since the Civil War to be trying to rally the American people. This is why he's up on Mount Rushmore. Okay, you'll read in Gerstle a number of reasons why maybe he shouldn't be up on Mount Rushmore. That he stands for America that maybe we don't necessarily want to remember or want to celebrate. The reason he's up there and the reason he should stay up there is because since the Civil War, he was one of America's, really since Lincoln, one of America's first great nationalists. Meaning North, South, East, West, rich, poor, white, black. Roosevelt stood for, not perfectly, especially on the racial line and on gender lines, but he stood for building a nation out of this interdependence, this chaos of independence since the Civil War, and out of the wreckage of the Civil War itself. Roosevelt is standing there calling Americans to build a new nation. He had hoped to do this through the Republican Party. They rejected him, so he is now going to do it through a new political party, the Progressive Party, to which we will turn our attention now. So get some exposure there to all of Roosevelt's new nationalism speech. So after delivering the new nationalism speech, Roosevelt begins to establish the Progressive Party as a third political party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt would sometimes call a Progressive Party platform the square deal. But he had been using that term before to kind of talk about his earlier reforms. He'll use it again to talk about a square, just kind of all throughout this time. He's talking about offering Americans a square deal. What exactly does that look like? What does the new nationalism look like in terms of a kind of practical politics? So let's look at some of the text, if you will, from the Progressive Party platform of 1912. This is the big election in which Republicans, Democrats will face off against the Socialist Party, but also Roosevelt's Progressive Party too. We'll go through and I'll stop at highlight certain parts of this, but at least you'll have exposure to the entire text should you want to look at it. Equal suffrage, the Progressive Party, believing that no person can justly claim to be a true democracy which denies political rights on account of sex, pledges itself to the task of securing equal suffrage to men and women alike. This is not something that Roosevelt had supported even when he was president of the United States. He had not supported that. Now, trying to build a national political coalition, he needed support of people like Jane Addams. Addams, recognizing substantial differences with Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, when Jane Addams is a peace advocate, and she's finding herself having to align with people like Teddy Roosevelt, she really had to sacrifice a lot, or she really struggled with that decision. But to kind of try to help meet Jane Addams halfway, Roosevelt does pledge himself to supporting women's suffrage now. A constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote in federal elections. Social and industrial justice. Prohibition of child labor. Minimum wage standards for working women. To provide a living wage. You can see that living wage, which had started among the working class, is now being brought into a major political party platform. General prohibition of night work for women, an establishment of an 8-hour day for women and for young persons. Notice a lot of this regulation of labor and labor protections are for women. 1 day's rest in 7 for all wage workers, the 8-hour day. Again, labor unions, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for what we will. Roosevelt says, okay, let's do it. The abolition of convict contract labor system, that does not end up happening, and it allows for the continuation of the convict lease system in the South. That's slavery by another name that I talked about in a previous lecture. Standards of compensation for death. I mean, essentially a kind of social insurance. A government paid insurance or compensation in certain kinds of industrial situations. Europe is already going towards social insurance programs for its workers. The United States is not quite ready to go that far, but Roosevelt and the progressives are the first major party. The socialists have been arguing for stuff like this for a while in the United States. The progressives are the first kind of major party to advocate for something like social work or something like a social insurance. We favor the organization of workers, men and women, as means of protecting their interests and of promoting their progress. It's about as far as Roosevelt goes in advocating for labor unions. He's still not fond of labor unions, particularly independent ones, because he feels like they can very easily become the storehouses of radical, anarchist, and socialist ideas. We want to establish a Department of Labor. Talking about reforms for farmers. This is an interesting one. We favor the union of all existing agencies of the federal government dealing with public health into a single national health service. Roosevelt is generally seen as the first president, and the Progressive Party is seen as the first party to advocate for. They were not calling for nationalized health insurance, but they were calling for a national health office at this time. So this is not the Affordable Care Act that we are under today, but it is laying the foundations for the belief that government had a responsibility to provide for the health of its populations. So again, we're not nationalized health care, but a national health service to oversee the delivery of health care throughout the states is something that Roosevelt and the progressives were the first to advocate for. Business, the language will still be one of control, of where need be, regulating certainly, but if they have to, doing some busting. We favor strengthening the Sherman Law by prohibiting agreement to divide territory. And so you see there, they don't want to get rid of Sherman. They want to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act. Same with the ICC. Things that Roosevelt had done in his term, they want to see those things go further. Finally, the concern for conservation. Foreign policy issues there at the end. So you can kind of get a sense of what the progressives were arguing for. Again, is progressivism the forerunner of socialism in the United States in arguing for greater government oversight or even regulation of corporations, in increasing worker rights? Does that mean the progressives are socialists, or is another way to understand them? Is Teddy Roosevelt and his later cousin Franklin Roosevelt, should they be considered socialists? On their own terms, these guys hated the socialists. They hated the radicals. They, in many ways, and you'll explore this a little bit, Gersel will talk a little bit about this in chapter 2 when he talks about the new nationalism and progressivism, too, which will reinforce some of what I'm saying or complement some of what I'm saying, is, rather than bring socialism to the United States, the Roosevelts are trying to stop the spread of socialism in the United States. Particularly socialism and anarchism as it's taken root among the working class and in labor organizations. The Roosevelts believe that the best way to stop that kind of independent radicalism is to have the federal government supporting workers, regulating businesses to make sure that government's keeping a handle on all of this. So in other words, it's possible to understand progressivism not as a form of radicalism, but as a form of anti-radicalism, trying to stop the socialist movements and the radical anarchist movements that were growing up among groups, particularly among labor groups like the industrial workers of the world that you'll encounter in the Roosevelt in the Gersel book. But again, I don't want to shape your thinking too much on this. If you're inclined to see the progressives as the beginning of socialism in America, I'm not going to stop you. Hopefully we can have occasion during lecture to take up these kinds of questions and work through some of this. So that's the Progressive Party. You'll also be reading in the Roosevelt book about the progressive views on race and how race factors into or does not factor into the Progressive Party platform as well too. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Ultimately, the Progressive Party will challenge the Republicans and Democrats and the Socialist Party in 1912. And the Progressive Party will do just probably as good as any third political party has ever done. But essentially what progressives do is just peel off a bunch of Republicans. So the Republican vote ends up being split. Socialists do pretty well. They do get about 1 million votes. They'll never receive as many votes as they do in the United States up to that time. They'll do pretty well, but still 1 million votes is nowhere near the 6 or 7 million votes that the progressives are getting, that the Republicans are getting, but those will not match because, again, splitting the Republican vote between Republicans and the progressives meant that the Democrats and Woodrow Wilson win the presidency. You'll read about Wilson. You'll have Wilson's speech. We'll talk about him more in terms of foreign policy, but I do want to kind of go through this, introduce him a little bit and as a progressive. Wilson is significant for, the question is, if liberalism begins in progressivism and progressivism comes out of the Republican Party, then how did liberalism end up being the philosophy of the Democratic Party? Woodrow Wilson is the first of those bridge figures. Franklin Roosevelt will be, of course, the major one, but Woodrow Wilson is one of the first, a Democrat who espouses progressive ideals too. Like Roosevelt, historian, a political scientist, who will eventually be governor, and from governor will make his way into the presidency in 1912, largely by accident from Roosevelt splitting the Republican votes. Woodrow Wilson is able to come in. Wilson espouses an ideal, the Progressive Party is talking about the new nationalism. Wilson says what we need is the new freedom. And Wilson promises to continue principles of limited government. He promises to maximize economic freedom and economic competition. What we need is, the new freedom. We don't need a larger centralized government. What we need is a government that will. We need a government that will not stand in the way of economic progress and the furtherance of this country. That's how Wilson campaigns on. And it's a message that very much appealed to the Democrats' southern base, who don't want the federal government interfering, like with Jim Crow, for instance. Southern Democrats loved Woodrow Wilson. He was a great candidate for them, but Wilson is also able to appeal pretty nationally as well too, with this message of the new freedom. So Wilson will win the presidency, but when he's in, he starts acting just like a progressive. It's almost like Teddy Roosevelt ended up being president after all, because what Wilson and Congress did was more or less enact so much of the Progressive Party agenda. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Federal Trade Commission of 1913 strengthens the power of the Bureau of Corporations. The Federal Reserve Board, a government agency that has the power power over the money system, the central banking system within the United States. Several constitutional amendments are passed under Wilson. The 16th Amendment, a graduated income tax, something that Wisconsin and other progressives have been arguing for a while, was more forms of direct democracy. The 17th Amendment was passed, the direct election of senators. And before this amendment, senators, like U.S. senators, were not elected by us. They were elected by state legislatures. The 17th Amendment creates direct election of senators. So you and I elect not just members of the House of Representatives, we elect our senators as well, too. This comes out of progressivism. Prohibition, banning the production and sale consumption of alcohol in the United States. Prohibition was seen as a progressive ideal, certainly with that Christian support, but it was also seen as a progressive ideal as well too, in creating a more sober, a more efficient, a more disciplined America. It's hard to explain, because we think we're swimming in alcohol today. It's hard to explain how much greater alcohol consumption was in American history before Prohibition, and how much the consumption of hard alcohol was in place there before Prohibition. When Prohibition would be repealed in the 1930s, Americans' alcohol consumption would never return to what it was in the years before. And Prohibition was considered a progressive reform, not just for Christian, but also for capitalist reasons as well. And then before Roosevelt leaves office, the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage. So what is the legacy of progressivism in the United States? Well, in many ways, those first three principles of progressivism would be realized. On the basis of Americans would be convinced, yeah, we are living in a different America. America of large cities, it can't be run like America of farms and small towns. We do need to make some changes. We do need to study our problems, our social problems more, and try to manage them. The federal government, state government, local government does have to do more to address these kinds of issues. Where progressivism never really catches on is on that fourth, a more responsible citizenship, a more active citizenship that would keep, especially the federal government, having to do more regulation. That doesn't quite catch on. 19th century conceptions of citizenship, defined more by participating in elections from time to time and the government leaving me alone to do what I want, still largely characterizes our citizenship up to the present. And so the more Christian ideal of the progressives, of being concerned for our neighbors, doesn't really catch on. And so the legacy of progressivism, well, again, like I said, we can debate this in the class. For some of you, it might be, well, this is where socialism begins. Certainly, this is where liberalism begins. This is where socialism begins. This is where we begin our, march towards socialism in the United States. We can debate that. Certainly, it is true that the idea of America as a regulatory state, that the federal government, the state governments, the local governments have a responsibility to regulate problems, to regulate the economy, to regulate in the name of the public interest or conservation efforts or worker rights or special groups like women. That this is something the government should do, that this is something that becomes fairly normal after this time. And so the regulatory state is probably the chief legacy of progressivism. There are concerns to reinvent American citizenship. That never quite catches on. All right, we'll have more to talk about this in class.